The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo's latest and biggest project to this new approach on open world games. I personally like to call these true open world games, as unlike other games, they don't have a million different markers in the HUD or map, and let you do things at your own pace, as all open world games should let you. To say that fans, including myself, were excited to see how Nintendo would follow up on the excellent Breath of the Wild is a huge understatement, and I'd say that Nintendo did not disappoint. Being an adult with a career and other responsibilities, I don't tend to sink this many hours into just one game. But somehow I managed to play Tears of the Kingdom to near 100% completion with 230 plus hours of playing time. Today, I would like to go into detail as to what kept me going for this long in Tears of the Kingdom, along with the various aspects of the game. More often than not, I avoid side quests in most open world games as they can be repetitive and tedious along with some redundant fetch questing. Tears of the Kingdom, however, had side quests I enjoyed so much that I couldn't get enough of them. Between getting nice rewards for completing them, along with meeting interesting characters and experiencing a story, they were nothing short of excellent. With how huge the open world is this time around, they were a great break from exploring the world and changed the pace up enough to keep me interested. Also the minigames. Can't forget how good the minigames are and how they use Link's newfound abilities, which are very prevalent in this game. The Sheikah Slate abilities in Breath of the Wild were astounding. There is no shortage of videos of people doing ridiculous things with those abilities, making Hyrule just one big sandbox. Getting rid of those abilities and adding in completely new abilities was a risky choice, but it paid off big time. After discovering and using these newfound abilities, I never really missed the old abilities from Breath of the Wild. The shrines, dungeons, and open world itself forces you to put these abilities to great use. My personal favorite has to be the Ultra Hand. I'm not one for building or putting things together, and I was a bit afraid this would be off-putting for me. But the way Ultra Hand works, combined with the situations the game has to force the player to use Ultra Hand, actually got me intrigued and drew my interest in getting creative with how to use a power to progress in the game. I'd say these new abilities just slightly edge out what we get in Breath of the Wild. Early on in the main story, Link has a quest that requires him to make his first entry into the Gloom world through a chasm. Upon entering the Gloom world for the first time, you will immediately notice that it is dark and you lose health permanently when attacked by an enemy if you stay in the gloom for too long. At least until you either find a light route or return to the surface. At first I found this to be quite difficult to deal with, and my immediate thought was, what is even the incentive of entering these chasms? Fortunately, I really liked the answer that I got to my question. In some ways, I even preferred exploring the Gloom world over Hyrule. You can unlock some really amazing outfits for Link that primarily pertain to past games, a must-do for any fan of the series. There are also repeat boss fights from the main story, along with lots of Poes to collect in order to get unique items. One of which is the Dark Link outfit. Of course, without spoiling too much, there are also some interesting quest lines that are done entirely in the Gloom world, and I do not recommend missing them. It's insane to think that not once did Nintendo feature the Gloom world in any trailers at all. This was for sure a welcome surprise. One welcome change this time around coming from Breath of the Wild is by far the dungeons. In Breath of the Wild, the dungeons, along with the boss in each dungeon, felt more or less the same between each other. You find a divine beast, figure out a way to infiltrate the divine beast either through a puzzle or boss fight, actually progress through the dungeon in which they are all very similar, and lastly, fight some variation of Ganon. This time around in Tears of the Kingdom, you talk to the sages in the region that are tied to the dungeon, while they also accompany you, and you get a somewhat traditional dungeon. I feel these dungeons definitely did a better job in terms of traversal and puzzles, and were a proper throwback to the kind of dungeons you would get in previous Zelda games prior to Breath of the Wild. Oh, and of course, you get a proper boss fight instead of a variation of Ganon. Sure, the fights are somewhat gimmicky in the sense that all the bosses have a glaring weakness to a newfound ability given to you from the sage that is tied to the region and dungeon, but that's a great way to force you to familiarize yourself with the newfound sage ability and get you good at it. For sure a step up from Breath of the Wild at the very least. By far, the most difficult thing to talk about without spoiling too much for those of you who haven't gotten all that far yet would be the main story, which will absolutely knock your socks off. It is easily the biggest thing that kept me going in the game. Knowing that Ganondorf is in this game, I was curious to see how he gets used as a main protagonist and was not at all disappointed. The real surprise, however, again without spoiling too much, is how Zelda actually gets used in the main story. Let's just say that she is more than just a pawn this time around. Although I was able to play Tears of the Kingdom to almost completion, not actual completion, I'm not Gerard, I could not help but be a bit disappointed about certain aspects of the game and feel discouraged from continuing my playthrough. By far the biggest disappointment has to be the Sky Islands, especially when you consider how much they were featured in the trailers. The first Sky Island area where you start the game is the best it ever gets. From there on out, it only goes downhill and gets fairly repetitive. I was under the impression that this would be a whole new world, but instead it feels like just a bit of extra area for each unique region in the game, with a boss fight or shrine here and there. Not only do the design of these areas all feel the same, but they recycle the same boss fights and shrine ideas throughout all the Sky Islands. It's such a shame, as Nintendo heavily featured this in the trailers for the game. I might be in the minority here, but when you combine the Gloom World, Hyrule, and the Sky Islands, this is a ridiculous amount of game. It took me 120 plus hours to play through Breath of the Wild, while it took 230 plus hours for me to play through Tears of the Kingdom for context. I feel that there was no need for the game to be this big. They could have found a way to make Hyrule somewhat smaller via the upheaval that happens in the story, or just something else entirely. We are all familiar with the problem how video games these days are just too big for their own good, and Tears of the Kingdom is no exception. I was ready to wrap up the game by the 100 or 150 hour mark, so you can only imagine how much slog I felt playing the game for almost another 100 hours with no idea of when it will end. I can't exactly recall if Breath of the Wild did this, but the game isn't as open-ended as I thought it would be either. There's an area in the Gloom World that looks peculiar. It has Raru's hand symbol on it just like you would see at any shrine, but unfortunately it is inaccessible as it requires for you to be very far in the main story. It may seem like a small gripe, but this to me is a big deal, as I was under the impression that we would get a truly open-ended experience where we may explore the world and everything it has to offer at our own pace and in any order that we want. Also, I wasted a lot of time figuring out what I was doing wrong in that area, like way more time than I would like to admit. With playing so much of Tears of the Kingdom and noting these gripes that I had about the game, I have a lot of high and specific hopes for the next Legend of Zelda game. And let's just be real here, that's the $1,000,000 question that we all asked after Breath of the Wild as well, and it makes sense to ask it in regards to Tears of the Kingdom as well. If we look at every 3D Legend of Zelda game before Breath of the Wild, they were all very different from one another and all brought something unique to the table. Tears of the Kingdom, however, directly builds upon Breath of the Wild and adds some additional features to it being a direct sequel after all. That's the thing, however, I don't want a direct sequel for the next Legend of Zelda game. This would allow for Nintendo to really think outside the box this time around in terms of the story, the open world, gameplay, the art style, and so on and so forth. Exploring the same Hyrule again was already going to be a major drag to the game, hence why Nintendo had the upheaval happen to rearrange what is going on in each region in the game and switch things up. For the next game, however, I'm not sure if that's really going to cut it. Maybe we get a new world altogether like how we got Termina in Majora's Mask? I'm not sure, and that's not my job. I'm glad it's not my job. When you make two excellent games in a row, it only gets harder to top it each time. Aside from the setting itself, I would like to see more elaborate dungeons, meaningful side quests, a smaller overall open world, and more unique boss fights. But that's my experience and take on Tears of the Kingdom. I liked what we got, but am somewhat concerned with what they will do in future entries for the series. Let me know what you agreed with, what you didn't agree with, and of course what your hopes are for future entries in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.